So Danny.
You didn't broadcast Dennis's name up?
No, we did not. And he was a tough act to follow, as was the earlier discussion on strategic sourcing. But I
And
actually,
Danny, I'm going to ask you to try to pull this in about 35, 40 minutes.
yeah,
to get back on schedule.
absolutely. And I actually think, and I joked at the end of Dennis's discussion that I could create a tie between the national security discussion and this, and I wasn't kidding actually. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But first, let's go just over some basic information on improper payments. On slide 16, you see the scale of the issue that we have: $115 billion annually in improper payments. So this is an enormous challenge for the federal government. The chart there shows you that Medicare and Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and earned income tax credit are the big players here. What is it, just to ground everyone, what is an improper payment from the federal perspective? It's very intuitive. We send funds to the wrong recipient, we do it in the wrong amount. We sometimes go and audit our payments and there's no documentation, so with the absence of proof, we call it an error. Or we have recipients using funds in an improper manner. And there's a whole range of different errors we see in practical terms. Just to give you a flavor, in the Medicare world, we could reimburse a provider for an MRI, but we go back and audit it and only a chest x-ray happened. And so we just reimbursed for a procedure that was 5 or 6 times more expensive than actually happened. These are the types of things that can occur. We also have in the Medicare world a huge challenge with what we call medical necessity. So a hospital admits a patient for inpatient procedures, but you go back and you look at the regulations, it should have been outpatient. That's very difficult to kind of fix. It involves doctor training and Medicare outreach. When you think about improper payments, before I move on, I want you to think about it in terms of some buckets. There are a bucket which is really, really challenging to navigate and fix. And medical necessity is an example. Another example would be that the payment that the government makes is based on household size or number of children living with the person who's filing for the benefit. We don't have a global child residency database to know. So for example, earned income tax credit, which is one of the big ones, to get the payment right, we have to know whether that individual has lived with their dependent child for 6 months or more during the year. Very, very difficult to assess. We're not planning to focus our discussions on that bucket. There are, however, a bucket of errors that exist that are within, we think, a greater degree of proximity of control for us to fix. And those involve areas where we're making basic mistakes because we're not integrating data effectively or looking at data effectively, and included in that is where we're being defrauded. So for example, we're not supposed to pay entities that have been suspended or debarred by the government, yet we do so. We do so because we don't have tools in place that better integrate that information into our payment processes, so we know before we make the payment, has this person been suspended or debarred? It gets more complicated, but also solvable. Sometimes we have a company that's suspended or debarred, and then they reincorporate themselves with a new name and a new structure, and then they're back doing business with us. We need to capture that, and then you need more multidimensional analysis of the data. Another thing that we're not very good at this period of time when we're trying to get there. And then there's obviously, there's fraud, there's identity theft, people setting up. This happens to the tune of billions of dollars. In particular, IRS faces that challenge where people with false identities file for tax refunds, and we have challenges in rooting that out before it occurs. So let's flip to slide 17. With our working group with the PMAB members, we've just talked about and focused our discussion around data and technology, and essentially how do we move out of the embryonic phase of that we're in right now of thinking about leveraging the information age, more data, more analytics, more forensics. We're getting the sense in areas such as national security, in areas such as law enforcement, that there is somewhat of a revolution that's been going on for quite some time, and how information is being used to look for anomalies, to understand what's going on in the broader sphere, to build into risk management a much more smarter approach to how we dedicate resources to attack particular types of risks. But in this area, we have not yet, we're not anywhere near, I think we need to be in terms of level of sophistication. So we need to take that journey that law enforcement and national security has taken before us, and we think pressure testing these ideas and these thoughts with our corporate partners makes a lot of sense. So we have both an agency-specific focus, and so for example, you'll hear from the Labor Department today about a challenge they have at UI. We also have Peter Bedetti here from CMS, who's tackling that issue for Medicare and Medicaid. And then we want to try to tackle this problem government-wide. And Neil Rowland from the Treasury Department is here to help talk to us about a government-wide forensic solution that we currently have under development. So with that, let me turn it over to Seth, who's going to give the unemployment insurance view.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by introducing the actual experts on this subject. Behind me is Dave Gilbert, who's the Director of our Office of Unemployment Insurance, and Jim Taylor, who's the Labor Department's CFO, and a former Deputy IG, so really quite knowledgeable in this area. So I'm going to jump back and forth between slides 18 and 19. UI is a joint state-federal program based on federal law, but it's administered by the states based on state laws that vary quite significantly. So there are 53 systems using different state laws, for example, with respect to eligibility. They use different processes for operation. They have different methods of delivery of checks. We regulate the state systems, monitor state administration to ensure that they're in compliance with state law. We oversee the federal UI trust funds, and we give states administrative funds and technical assistance to help them with their operations. Now, we've been working quite aggressively over the last 2 years with our state partners to try to get at improper payments. And if you'll turn to slide 19, you'll see the latest data that we have, which is from calendar year 2001. And the latest data show that we have been able to make some progress in bringing the improper payment rate down. The middle column is calendar year, the preceding column is fiscal year, so that's the latest in the middle. So we brought it down, but obviously we have a lot more to do. On slide 19, it shows you the principal causes of, or all the causes of the improper payment rate. The principal causes, the largest causes, and the ones that we think we can influence are four. Benefit year earnings, which is a fancy way of saying people keep collecting UI even though they've gone back to work. Work search, state UI laws uniformly require that while you're receiving UI, you be engaged in active work search. Some claimants fail to perform a report when they're engaged in work search. Separation errors, this is employers failing to tell us why somebody's been separated. That is relevant to eligibility under UI. And employment service registration, claimants just fail to register with their state's employment service, which is the principal method of providing the employment services to unemployed and dislocated workers. For the 2011 IPI, so those are the principal areas that we're focusing on. For the 2011 reporting period, and this is in the right corner, bottom corner of slide 19, we estimate that about 26% of all UI overpayments were due to fraud, or about 3% of the total benefits paid. As you can see, over 2/3 of the fraud overpayments are due to claimants continuing to collect after they've gone back to work. So they are misrepresenting to us that they are unemployed rather than back at work, rather than simply making a mistake. So flipping back to slide 18, what are some of the challenges that we face? First is this is a decentralized program that we have very limited tools to influence. We're using the full toolbox that Congress has provided to us. We're using policy guidance. We're putting performance measures in place, technical assistance, shaming. We've put a website up that shows every single state's improper payment rate broken out. We've also showed whether or not they're doing the set of things we think they need to do to bring their rate down. We're funding incentives, and we're using the bully pulpit all over the country now. Another problem is information technology capacity. Most states' IT systems in UI are quite antiquated. The median age of the state UI IT system is 20 years old. We have one that, by the way, is more than 40 years old. There are states that are still programming in COBOL. Data sources to support prevention and detection are limited. Cross-matching of databases is one of the most important things that you can do to address this issue. For example, the National Data Directory of New Hires helps states to identify when a claimant has gotten back to work. The problem is there's a 5 to 6 week time lag in that data, so that BYE problem, that people going back to work but still collecting UI, isn't really addressed by the NDNH as well as we'd like it to be. Also, federal law prohibits states from simply acting on a data cross-match. They have to verify it by some kind of personal contact under federal law. That obviously means a tremendous resource investment by the states to try to go after these problems. So we're working now with 3 states to pilot the use of financial data from banks to try to get the data much, much more quickly. And also, states don't have expertise in the capacity for data analytics and for predictive modeling. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about how I think you can be helpful to us. So we've been focused on the largest causes. As I mentioned, there are 4. There are 3 that we're really focused on: BYE, employment service registration, and separation. To address BYE, we've given money to states to engage in much more frequent cross-matching with the National Directory of New Hires to identify when a claimant may have gotten back to work. States are now, when they find out that somebody has gone back to work, immediately notifying them, saying, hey, we know you're back to work, don't collect any more UI benefits. And we've also developed some messaging tools to remind people. Some people think, not legitimately, but mistakenly, that if you go back to work, you can continue to collect UI until you get your first paycheck. That's not right. We're reminding them with a messaging campaign nationally. To address separation issues, we've worked with states to develop a standardized IT application that's called SIDES to enable very quick electronic communication between states and employers on separation, the reason for separation. And now we're turning to strategies that are going to focus on work search and fraud. So let me quickly identify 3 areas. I think these will match up with the list that Danny is going to give you shortly, of 3 areas where I think that this group can be most helpful to us. The first is, to be blunt, we are not using advanced data analytics for identifying trends or risks or patterns of behavior prediction at all. Second, if you have ideas about organizational structure, we've gotten all of the states to get cross-functional teams together. We've supported them in doing that. But you may have thoughts about what kind of team or what kind of structure is effective in going after this problem. And then third, communications and messaging. We have the problem both of internal communications to our state partners and to our own organization, but also external to our potential customers.
One question, if I may. What is the penalty for the individual? What happens to the person who has been overpaid in the context of this, where you discover they started a job and continued their benefits?
The money is taken back out of your, correct me if I'm wrong, Gabe, the money is not clawed back. It is taken out of your next set of unemployment benefits. So if you're unemployed weeks 1 through 5, week 5 is an improper payment. When you are unemployed again in week 20 to week 25, they will reduce the amount of your payment during that period.
There's no punitive aspect.
To bring up, no, it's not. If it's not fraud, there's no punishment. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
It's wacky.
And then the reason we can't claw back right away is that we don't have the processing systems.
I'm sorry? I think it's an authority question. Okay.
That's correct. We, first of all, like we do think that they're spending everything. They've obviously already received the money. So our primary way to get benefits back is to offset future benefits, or to enter into agreements with the person to bring back the money. Or other states use gains and garnish wages. There are a variety.
And there's the top, should we mention the top program?
Right. We now have the authority to offset federal income tax returns, and the states are beginning to implement that now.
So we're now working with states to get them signed up for the Treasury Department's top program, so that way the money can come out of federal tax returns rather than coming out
But
of
it's
future
dollar for dollar,
unemployment
there's no
benefits.
penalty for having done it.
That's
Right.
right, only for fraud.
Only if it's fraud.
The federal requirement for 25%, 15% penalty for fraud for claimants. And other states have more rigorous penalties depending on their law.
Sorry, what was the number that is improperly paid in this specific situation where I've gone back to work and I've been...
About 30% of, our estimate is that about 30% of overpayments.
So about
improper
3%
overpayments.
overall.
3% of the total is improper payments.
Was that?
So what's the number? So
The
3%.
total unemployment insurance annually right now is what?
Well, that's a good question. But our improper payment rate is roughly $13 billion.
Right. So 100, so that,
It's-
yeah, call it 100 billion-ish, so $3 billion.
$3 billion, yeah. So
No, that's not right. It's it is a
Of the
third.
13.
It's a third of the total overpayments, which is
400 million.
Yes. That's it. That's it.
So now, if you have the ability, the next time they go on to hold it back, right? And so that means you know. And that means we have a method to know that this person's been overpaid. Right? Meaning if we can hold it back in the future,
You must know that.
we must know now. And so the issue is really we don't have the authority to claw it back right away.
Do we know real time or we know in
As
retrospect?
soon as we're able to detect this, adjudicate it, and get the facts from the, and make a decision, we can stop the claim at that point and then begin to offset future benefits.
But our knowledge is highly imperfect for the
Right.
universe of when this has occurred.
Yeah, the
When
fact
we,
that you have it doesn't mean you know.
yeah, when we see it,
You know.
we can do the offsets. What part of this discussion is we have blind spots in a lot of these different areas.
The cost of a clawback, whether it's in the public or private sector, would be, I think, prohibitive. So in terms of how do we stop the problem before it occurs?
Yeah, right.
And the other thing is, we're talking about clawback from people that are uninsured, so presumably there's no money to claw back. So I just would question the wisdom of throwing money after it. Clawbacks are hard enough in the private sector, they
Right.
don't work.
Well, they're getting paid though. At this point, they're actually getting paid to just garnish their wages. But I agree with your point, let's prevent it.
I've never seen,
Except many times,
person by
by the time
person,
you identify
the
them,
cost
no longer-
benefit, I would be surprised if it worked
no
out.
longer
See that strategy.
Yep.
Okay, do you want, Neil, why don't we, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that was a comment.
No, I was saying, except many times by the time you identify an improper payment, they no longer have income.
That's why we.
So you gotta wait until they either go back to work or they come back on unemployment or whatever they're doing.
That's right.
In an unemployment claim, does the state pay money as well as the federal government?
It's
So
dangerous.
The question again is,
are the state and the federal government aligned in the goal of trying to reduce this? I.e., do
Yeah, the
they
mon-
pay money too?
the money goes back into the UI trust fund. So it's to pay out, it'll end up paying out additional, it'll pay out.
No, but
benefits
just
in
do the
future.
overall structure between state and federal on UI.
Right,
Money
each
flow.
state has its own trust fund, which is overseen by a federal trust fund. It's sort of aggregated into a federal trust fund. The money goes back into the trust fund, so we have no disincentive to getting that money back. The states have no disincentive to getting it back. It's fair to ask whether or not they have a sufficient incentive
That's what I
to
meant
go out and
by
get the
that.
money. Because the effect is somewhat attenuated, so they get the money back, the money goes into the trust fund, it gets paid out at some point in future benefits. Theoretically, if you collected enough money, it would reduce the tax rate for employers in your state by some amount, or it would give you additional money to pay out additional benefits to more unemployed people. But it's several steps attenuated from that policy result.
So, Neil, why don't we shift to the government-wide solution?
So let me first introduce my colleague Dick Gregg, who's our fiscal assistant secretary. He's in charge of making about 85% of the payments that the government makes, doing the lion's share of the debt collection, and also financing the government, all of our notes and bills and public debt auctions. He supervises. So we are trying, as Danny suggested, to create, it's still in its nascence, I think it's fair to say, a utility for the government at large that would allow us to better capture payments that shouldn't be made before they're made, both at the moment of or before the moment of eligibility for programs or for qualifying folks to do business with the government, before payments are actually issued, and then a capability that will allow us post-payment to do the kind of analytics that every financial services company in America does in the main, both with respect to fraud detection or other weaknesses in the system that are helping contribute to the enormous amount of improper payments that Danny identified at the start. Treasury is sort of the natural place because we are sort of the core payments function of the government, and because we've done something relatively analogous on the debt collection side over the last 10 years to, I'd say, reasonably good effect, although still striving to improve there as well. So the basic idea, and we're working with the Kansas City Fed, who are in fact our contractors on this, have some capacity and some IT that is useful to us, are working on creating a portal. It exists now. It's still, I think, without important aspects of functionality that allow agencies, the Treasury and other agencies, again, both at the moment of eligibility and at the moment of payment, on a continuous basis, that's the goal, to look at a series of databases that the government has that look at, and they're listed on this page, who's died, who is ineligible to do business with the government, either because they've been debarred as procurement contractors or because in the national security world they're subject to some sanction or another by the U.S. government, or ineligible to receive payments for Medicare, Medicaid, other federal health programs, etc. And to really be able to do this in real time, have agencies send files, huge files of potential beneficiaries or contractors or with respect to payments payees, and see who's not eligible, and the government already understands, and some part of the government isn't eligible for a payment, and do that kind of core, pretty straightforward matching exercise that, again, is done in your all's world every day, and that we just haven't had the capacity to do. We are working on the back end piece of this with respect to the data analysis and the sort of post-payment sense of things that will help inform how we do the front end, both with the Kansas City Fed, as I mentioned, but also with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a bureau of the Treasury that focuses in a range of capacities on financial crime and on following flows of money, mostly in the money laundering space, but in other spaces as well, and have, we think, a lot of expertise that can be brought to bear on this set of challenges. The challenges are not insubstantial, apart from this being early days and are really just starting to ramp up on the IT and on the functionality, on the governance, all, I think, topics where your all's input could be particularly useful. We face a set of challenges that are maybe not uniquely governmental, but I think exacerbated by our particular circumstance. One relates to this set of issues about privacy and balancing information sharing, which at the end, at the core of this is what this is about. With privacy concerns, we have a set of statutory constraints there and political constraints on top of those that are not insubstantial, and working those through will be important. So, for example, in order for agencies to continuously monitor the databases that we have available to us that suggest names of payees who shouldn't be eligible for payments, we at Treasury have to work through on an agency-by-agency basis matching agreements, actual data sharing agreements with each agency one by one. So it's an arduous kind of task, and in order to change that, we need a change to statute. That's, I think, unlikely to come anytime soon. There's another set of challenges, I think, that relate to the basic tension between constituencies and our own policy goals and wanting to make payments on the one hand, and taking extra care to not make improper payments on the other. Those are both important objectives, and getting that balance in the right place is a very complicated thing, and moreover, it's probably a different balancing act for different programs and for different kinds of payments, and so it's very, very textured. I think the last thing that
You have a question?
sorry, sure.
Do you need data matching agreements in place before you do the
We
data
do.
matching service?
We do. So we have a few, but there are lots and lots of parts of the government, and we need one with each one of them in advance before we can actually do this continuous feed of data back and forth.
Is that the longest pole in the tent? Or
I don't know. These are all pretty long polls. I think the politics around privacy complicated. The issues around, so there are lots of kinds of payments that we make, the federal government in the aggregate, Treasury included, where there's an overwhelming impetus for policy reasons to make the payments, to sort of pay first, ask questions later. That's the basic sort of context in which we find ourselves. And then, so the question is how to recalibrate that balance with respect to a circumstance in which that may have gone too far, and the level of improper payments, obviously.
So I don't want to take us
Sure.
too much time, but what caused the 2 or 3 agencies that gave you the agreements the comfort to do so and overcome the privacy and other process concerns?
I think it's not so much comfort. I think this has just been put online in April. We're just early days. It's just a question of doing the mechanics of getting that worked through. And my strong sense is that more will come, and reasonably quickly. And moreover, the functionality of the system as it exists today, of the portal as it exists today, is not, none of you would find it overwhelmingly impressive. And as it gets more impressive, and as we roll out more capacity, it will bring, I think, more people to want to take advantage of what it has.
And how long do you estimate till you're where you want to be with the matching agreements? 6 months, 9 months, 4 months, a year?
Well, no, it's pretty arduous. I mean, so for example, I think there is a possibility, especially if Jeff and his colleagues help us push forward with other agencies and say, here's a template. Maybe there's reason to deviate from a template, but here's a basic template that we could expedite that process. But left to its own devices, dealing with each, agency, and in particular, a set of independent agencies who are not, cabinet agencies who have some measure of independence from the president and from the Treasury, is going to be a long, arduous tease, but could be years. Could be years.
What's a good scenario to where we could be at sort of 80% of potential?
I think, I hate to hazard a guess, 18 months.
So I think Neil's right. There's a lot of elbow grease to these privacy agreements, but in running parallel to having what can be a painful meeting, bringing in the agencies, all their lawyers, and working out the details, and I've sat in on a few of them. Parallel to that, we're also working with some privacy legal experts in the government to see if there is a framework or kind of a generic solution that can, almost like the GSA schedules, can we get everyone on a similar train, and we're trying to do that.
Kind of a baseline,
I give you a huge database of information that is deeply relevant to this conversation that, as yet we haven't tapped, and it's a database within Treasury, our tax data, which obviously is sort of the third rail of data privacy with respect to, government information, and so, it puts in quite quick, I think, and clear relief just how tricky some of the issues around this are.
Your most
Having
valuable
said
data
that,
set.
excuse me?
That's your most valuable data set by far.
It's enormously valuable, and it's incredibly constrained for our use statutorily. I mean, the detail with which we are managed with respect to what we can do with tax information is I think substantially more than you'd imagine. And so I think there's a bunch we can move forward pretty quickly. We need help, and I think your insights, your experience, and those of others in the private sector who can help us with things like process issues, data integrity issues, just basic blocking and tackling that is prevalent in the private sector, but which we are struggling to accelerate our efforts around, would be enormously useful, and then we'll continue to work through these thickets that have a more political and statutory dimension.
So there's a lot of different ways to take this conversation. On slide 21, basically taking a kind of a macro angle, but I'm really happy to go into any direction. Let me just talk you through what we kind of our overview from a macro standpoint is that when we take a step back from this, we recognize, and what we see is that the state of the union here is very embryonic or non-existent use of technology to attack this problem across government. Neil described we have a government-wide solution. It's nascent. Seth said we don't really have that capacity at labor. Peter's here from CMS, and they've started out. But again, one question that we're raising is why is that, and how do we get to a better place? This question, that's why I was joking earlier. Someone said earlier, why can't we take what Dennis talked about and apply it to paper clips? And we've had this similar discussion in some of our earlier discussions that we call it the NASA effect. We don't have to worry about NASA and being on the cutting edge of technology. The reality of NASA's mission and the reality of that organization and its culture, it just happens. They are going to be at the cutting edge of technology in any endeavor that they take. But when you look at less priority functions, like how are we looking at fraud and error in government payments to individuals, contractors, and grantees, we don't have the incentives, the longstanding culture, the infrastructure to do that. And so one global question that we have is how, in this particular area, in any area of government, do we position our organization better to be at the cutting edge? Not just, hey, here's the latest technology, but also understanding what's going on in there. Because Neil said earlier, just about every finance company in the world is using sophisticated stuff to find identity theft. Credit card companies, etc. They have run out 100 yards ahead of us.
But they've got a clear incentive, right? It's the bottom. It's the bottom line of the company, and so credit card fraud used to be 1% in the 80s, and if they had done nothing, it would be 10%. But they've kept managing it down, and that's bottom line profit. So that's how you drive their motivation. So the question, what's the equivalent?
Well, see, that's why our motivation is much more complicated, and that's why the political tension that I talked about. People want payments to go out.
Yeah.
Right. Sure.
Same thing is true in
And so,
UI, exactly the same problem.
the presumptions, in a sense, are flipped.
We talked earlier, I mean, it comes down to exactly what Enrique was saying, human nature, which is, honestly, if you're not going to incent the behavior change that you want to have happen, it's not a matter of getting the database in, right?
Exactly.
It really isn't, because it's just still, so I guess my question is, you know, people only change when they have to, right? No one fixes the roof out when it's sunny. So if you've identified how much the improper payments are, you do have a mechanism that says we can cut your budget by X or Y because we know this percent, you can't do that. You just
Congress gets to do that.
and you can't present that we've identified this much, and so, you know, how do you hold people?
Well, you might, but
in
you know,
the
the
private
Congress is
sector-
gonna say, you know, we want these payments to go out.
Right.
And we want you to fix the improper payments thing, because that's of course waste. But how you organize the one and the other is not so clear. So I'm just saying the normal tools that you have to penalize, you know,
Which
the
is-
P&L effect, you know, to put a constraint on it. I'm not saying there aren't things in the direction you're suggesting, I think there are plenty, but there is this kind of core reality that
Well,
the
what do you do
tools
with
are
everything you
different.
save, right? So we do stuff internally with improper payments and whistleblower and everything like that. With everything you save, you know, what's your skin in the game on it,
Well, let me,
right? You can't do any of that.
well, in the SNAP program, food stamps,
Yeah.
we actually were rewarding states that would bring down their
Right.
improper payment rate. And in the budget cutting scenarios that we're in now, that's the first thing that the appropriators cut out because it's not necessary. So
Wait.
we don't have full control over some of these.
Sounds like a great
issues.
program. You're on a great program. I like your program.
I think Liz
Cut
is-
that program.
I think Liz, your
How
question
is that, how
great.
is that working
So,
before it's cut?
It was working well. It does incent, it loves the stars to shine and be models for other states. It provides an incentive. And we also help the people who are the worst in the improper payment too. We target some money to them to bring them up to the.
That's Kathleen, that sounds like a great program.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, we started the PMAP on, you know, how do you drive performance management. It's the exact same thing. When you have a whole system built around rewarding the status quo and the average performer, the answer is that, of course, you're not going to get a structural shift. So unless you can find your way to having skin in the game and rewarding the top performers in a meaningful way, you know, you can data mine all you want.
I guess the question I had is, when your budget is reduced, is that amount of money reduced, or is that line item removed and you're prohibited from spending the money on that line item?
The latter.
I'm sorry?
The latter. I
Okay.
mean, there's certain things that, it depends.
it depends on whether they reduce the top line of the agency, or whether they just reduce this element of it and leave the top line alone. And the Congress can do either, and they do both all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to understand is whether it's simply a matter for you of reallocating your remaining resources, or whether it is a prohibited activity. But let me suggest something here. I guess, and ask the question first about point of clarity. Is the issue that you don't have the human and technological resources to aggressively pursue the initiative outlined here? I mean, is it a skill and human resource capability and technical capability in these agencies?
I think that's part of it.
That's part of it.
What percent of the problem is that addressed?
Quarter.
Percentage, like, there's no incentive to it.
I think there's a bunch of that. I mean, so for example, if you stop a bunch of improper payments, and just take a benefits program, the savings are not going to redound to the benefit of that agency. They're going to just go away. So there's at an agency level.
Well, they go to taxpayers.
No, I'm just saying they go away, meaning they drop to the general fund, to the basic general fisc. But at the organizational level, the Department of X, Y, or Z is not going to be the immediate beneficiary of that virtuous behavior.
So let me ask you a question. I'm thinking about the conversation we just had, where the reason that people don't want to buy off a GSA schedule is because of control, trust, they think they can do it better. The question I have for you guys is there a feeling out there that, you know, makes people angry, people are committing fraud, they want to stop it, or is it, it's hardly on my radar screen. Because this feels like a different kind of set of incentives than handing over your purchasing. This feels like the way to motivate people is, you know, there's crimes being committed here.
Yeah, but
Well,
wait,
but
just
that's
a
I
quick
think we
question.
really need to clarify that the majority of, for instance, of the overpayments or improper payments in SSA are not
That's what I was gonna
fraudulent.
say.
It's the complexity of the
Right.
program, it's
Exactly.
also the due process
So
that
people
we
can
have
be
to
well-intentioned and
provide.
they're doing this by mistake.
Exactly.
So
That's
just
the reason why,
Right.
Gail, that's
So
the
of the
reason why as well.
115 billion, that was the point I was gonna make, 115 billion of improper payments, about what is fraud? Percentage-wise?
We don't have.
I know, but give a
it's-
guess.
It's in the 5%.
That's what I thought.
Oh,
So,
all right.
done.
Less for us.
Yeah,
Right.
but let me make this, but, you know, this is a strategic point, and I've struggled with this, I've been at this for almost a decade now, this improper payments issue. Because at first, I had Carolyn's reaction, this is not all fraud, but then I started to feel like the notion of the importance of it is elevated. So I make a big deal, for example, when a Treasury IG report comes in and talks about identity theft in IRS, I make a big deal about that because I'm trying to, as you said, galvanize energy and accountability, that this isn't the foundation of why we're in government for stewardship reasons and trying to create that incentive. Because without those financial tools, because going back to the NASA effect, what's the incentive at NASA to use the great? Now, obviously, there's safety incentives in lives, so there's the safety component, but also there's it's scientific exploration. It's short of financial. It's not that NASA administrators get to keep a cut if they do more technology. So I've been trying to find what that nexus is. Yeah, and you
Well,
mentioned
you're kind of on the side of the angels here. If you're thinking of how to motivate people around it, it's not like, hey, hand this over because there's another group that can do it better. You know, the question is, how do you just get people to realize that this is just pure and simple waste? And I don't know if you have to give them a cut of the waste. I'm not sure that's true. It just seems like the
Well,
common
there's gotta be
person.
some skin in the game. Let me ask you something. You've been at this for a decade.
I don't think there has to be.
Not financial. It doesn't have to be financial when I say to
But just, it is the greater good. I mean, that's why smart people like this are serving government, right?
It's much more complex than that. At Social Security, we send out $720 billion a year. Our Title II, which is the trust fund area, we only have about 2.2% fraud. When we begin to deal with the SSI population, which is a means testing program, and you're looking at resources and assets, and you look at the population that we're serving, we have to find tools that allow us to identify whether or not they have assets up front. So we've been very successful with our partnership with, say, the financial industry, where we have the access to financial institutions, and we're able to go out and very quickly ask, 5 banks right now in their area, identify whether or not they have assets, and then we can then look at that. But we don't do that at the initial application because we don't have the ability or the resources to do it. We do it later often, and so they are already received the benefit. Then we learn that they have resources, and we have the challenge of going back. What we need to do is get to a point where we have the resources where every time someone makes application, we can automatically go out and discern whether or not they have assets or resources. And then you're dealing with a population that has many times no permanent address. They move a lot, their living arrangements change, and every time any one of those things happen, they're supposed to report it to us. We have 1,500 data matches, and we're very effective in using those, but those are not adequate. So I'm hoping that you can sort of offer some other ideas of other tools that we might use. We've got to deal with prevention, how to prevent it from going out the door. And we've had a number of simplification proposals that have gone to Congress and they never moved. But to give you an example, if we want to move someone off the rolls and they appeal due process, it could be months before a decision is reached. We have to continue to pay them until that appeal is finished when we know that they're going to come off the rolls. And they probably know it too. And then once they have a decision that's in our favor, we have to go back and try to collect.
Neil?
I totally agree with you, Liz, that having a sort of right incentive structure and doing classic performance management, using those tools is a big thing. I'd say here, though, there's I think there's a constraint, with respect to the tools available. I think that in the main, we're talking about people who are administering these programs that really do want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
There- You know, there's exceptions, of course.
That's been my sense.
And are very
so
focused
I'm
on
not sure.
doing that. They feel pride in how they're administering these things. I think what they don't have, and I think what we're finding as we work through this portal, I think what you're hearing from Seth, what you're hearing from Carol and so forth, is they don't have tools. And that their IT sort of circumstance, their ability to actually do what they'd like to do is constrained by the inability to actually, you know, figure out who is getting money that they oughtn't be getting. And I think, you know, my own view, although Danny and Jeff, my other view is that, you know, the private sector is particularly well suited to help us figure out how we can bring to bear a set of tools that, you know, would bring big advantage in this area and that we basically don't have.
Yeah.
Or very
Let me
substantially don't have.
make one suggestion, which is as you look at the specific types of tools you need, there's a process that I've used, I don't know if it's applicable in this setting, it's something we use called co-sourcing, where we basically identify a capability we did not have, both in terms of human resources and skills. We would find vendors who had those capabilities, and we would contract with that vendor for the express purpose of building that capability in our organization. So we would bring them in, they would operate it, they would help us recruit and train the staff necessary to maintain the capability, and then over a 2 or 3 year period, their contract goes away, and we're left with the residual capability that's been institutionalized and used. So if you think about that in the context of the technology and tools that you need, because if you don't have the tools, you don't have the capability, it's going to be hard to invent them. And what you also don't want to do is be permanently captive of the vendor, as opposed to a co-sourcing arrangement where the vendor is paid to do, in essence, a technology and tool transfer to you.
And if I understand you correctly, the practical impact, instead of hiring the consulting firm to come build you a tool, you hire like a credit card company who's already using a particularly effective mechanism to build that.
They know how to
for
do
you.
this, you don't know how. And the objective of the assignment is to leave you with both the capability, the hardware, the software, and the human resources as part of your organization, able to really institutionalize this.
Build, operate, transfer.
Yeah.
Say that again.
Build, operate,
transfer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't want to build, you want to implement, and you want to institutionalize. Implement, institutionalize.
Yeah, so for us, I think that's great. I think, you know, the challenge would be who are the sort of parties with whom we might be able to do that. So for us, the Treasury, doing that with financial services firms has a set of complexities. But absolutely.
There are many other software companies who'd be interested.
Make sure you check first that anybody you hire hasn't been debarred.
You know, for what it's worth, we also have unbelievable legacy systems, COBOL programs. I think we have some in machine language. I mean, they're really old. And we started revamping our IT, going to the usual suspects to figure this out. And I woke up in the middle of the night in the sweats thinking, so much is happening in the technology world. Are we just getting to the point where we're about to throw this away? So we actually went on a technology quest. We went to Silicon Valley, we talked to VCs, we talked to startups, we talked to the usual suspects like, you know, Google and Apple, and the whole thing was what's new under the sun. Because I do think that particularly in data warehousing, cybersecurity, fraud, there's a lot going on, and your legacy systems may be a good place for you to leapfrog 10 more versions of this stuff in a way that isn't as painful as some of the credit card companies had to go through. So.
Let's do 5 minutes on what we do between now and October. So I'm hearing you focus on tools.
Yeah.
But engage, Dan, you're going to take us away with the team, think through July through October report plan. So let's use 5 minutes to get the council live with PMAT members and others to lead it.
Can I ask a question on tools? So, have you had those meetings with the outside, you know, IT experts and, you know?
Yeah, we've had a bunch, but again, you know, we tend to go to IT firms, not financial service firms, so we're not going to Goldman Sachs or, you know,
Right.
whatever.
There's a lot, it doesn't, I mean, I don't, yeah.
Or American Express, or, so we've had some, but I think, my pretty clear sense is we could benefit from a whole lot more, and, I'll let Dick speak for himself, but, I think we could do plenty more of that, and there's a lot we can learn.
I think one of the deliverables, let me reverse engineer. I think by the fall, where we want to be is in a place where Seth and his team have a very effective plan for how they're going to deploy a new solution within the organization. I think Neil and his team can have they've already initial launch, but their expansion and their critical path going forward pressure tested against a global review that involves a lot of input from.
It sounds like your challenge is multiple, many times more complex because you have to depend on the state systems.
Right.
So Neil's challenge is pretty daunting to begin with, but at least it's in the federal system. So you have to deal with 50 state systems, including people that are still using COBOL. So I don't understand the respective responsibilities of you versus the states and how you solve for that problem.
Right, the big problem that we have is that we don't have the data. So if one of the problems is data analytics and data mining, we don't have it, the states have it. But we have had success in other contexts, and actually in UI as well, bringing states together in consortia. For example, trying to get over this incredible technology mountain that some of the states are facing, bringing them together in consortia and funding the consortia so that they can test ideas or develop infrastructure is one way to deal. Now, it doesn't get you all 53 jurisdictions involved, but it allows you to test some propositions. So we've had some very preliminary conversations about that. We're not going to get everybody to Windows 2010 by doing that, but it's a way of.
What are going back to the earlier discussion about incentives? What is the state's financial incentive to participate? Because the payments are coming. There's a disconnect between who's paying and who's administering, if I'm understanding this right. Do they get a benefit for avoiding improper payments?
To the extent they can save money, it either allows them, in theory, to reduce taxes or pay more benefits. Because this is employers, this is the money you all are paying in your FUTA tax. That is, in some number of cases, not all of our improper payments, but in some number of those cases, only people who should get it. So if you can keep that from happening, it's more money, either so you don't have to raise taxes, you can reduce taxes, or you can pay more out in benefits. Now that incentive is, as I said before, is a little bit attenuated. But I think they really want to do the right thing, and we've given a lot of visibility into how each state is doing with this website and by publicizing it fairly broadly, and every state has responded enthusiastically, particularly those that we see as being most at risk, the worst actors.
Can I just ask something about the
Sure.
tool? Because I have a problem jumping straight to tools, because I think what you need I don't even know what architecture, what governance, what you want to do. So every time I've always had to clean up a mess, it's because someone bought a new tool or partnered with a co-source and brought in a new tool versus having, what is the end game? What is the end vision? So spend your time up front thinking, what is the architecture need to look like? What does the governance need to look like? The tools will then come. I have seen so many failures of going after the sexy new tool unless you have that end game in mind and structure. I've written off more tools that I can count because the strategy hadn't been there, the structure, the governance, the decision rights hadn't been there. I would encourage you to, I have no time, but a Deloitte, an Accenture, I don't know why you're going to JP Morgan or to the banks. You need to figure out, I would think, first and foremost, what is the structure and the wiring that we want, and then go to the tools. I get very nervous when I think about, let's go talk to this and that.
So just to add to that, I mean, actually further upstream than that, is this one that we should think about rescoping the problem?
I agree.
Like, before we go into its analytics, its collaboration, its organization design, it's this tool, it's the data matching agreements, I like it, but I'm not even sure what problem we're trying to solve.
Right.
I'm aware of it not esoterically, high level, but should we rescope and say, should we go after Medicare, Medicaid, earned income tax credit, unemployment, or much like Jeff and Enrique on the other one, where you said, let's go for the common denominator, the baseline, hotel, transportation, strategic source. Is there a baselining I don't know what that is, on a category called improper payments, and it's not 115 million, maybe I'm making it up, it's 40 or 50. It's a subset that you don't have the interdependencies and the lack of control that you're describing. Maybe it's a smaller impact area around improper payments. So I would think about rescoping, and then we could talk about, it's really, you're talking about technology, process, and I think the organization
Don't you think
design.
we need to know
can I
how
just
to
add-
structure to attack it first?
Can I just add something to this? One of the questions I raised and when I was getting briefed about this is, I'm not clear myself on how we come up with these numbers of what was improper payment, whether we do it retroactively, how we know, and how we count that, because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So one of the things that I would find helpful, at least, and maybe you guys have done this, is what is that universe, and what are the different ones that we can attack, and what is the, now this is not necessarily relevant to your issue, Seth, within labor, because the 400 million may be very impactful for you, but from a government-wide point of view, if we looked at the big number, this is another case of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good and going after the low-hanging fruit. It may be that the tools necessary to go up after the big numbers are easier to come by, and so it would be helpful when we scope the problem to understand what are the big buckets, how do we go after them, what are the different kinds of tools before we try to invent a machine to go after everything. So one of the baseline pieces of data that I was wondering about is, when we say there's X dollars of improper payments, how do we know that? What is it? How do we monitor? Do we go back in time when we recover payments, and how do we sort it? What is the nature of this problem?
Okay, so page 16 has the breakdown at a high level. So that's a fair question you just asked, Jeff. It basically says, the different buckets, right?
And we don't need to do it here, but I'm happy to provide all the background in the world on how we get those numbers.
So there's a set of numbers on page 16, and so what we did was we then went Seth on unemployment insurance, and then he broke down on page 19, right? Go down to 19. That I agree with what both the teams said, but we do have, if you look at 19, it's got the root cause of where these payments are going.
No, but what I'm suggesting is, let's go to strategic sourcing. We said 538 billion.
Yep.
150 billion it's a subset of that number.
Right.
You have the 115, we believe the 115. You've given the 5 areas of
Big
diagnostics. We believe it. Is all 115 from a capacity standpoint, an interdependency standpoint, a complexity standpoint, is that all reasonable to go after?
No.
Or, hold it, or is it a subset of 115? It's 80, it's 60, it's 40. I think we need that number first. And then when you get that number, then we, using the strategic sourcing as an analogy, say, what are kind of the baseline things? They're data service matching agreements. There are a couple, maybe they are what they are. And let's go after that and start to the low-hanging fruit analogy applied to improper payments.
Let me take
That's
it
all I'm
back. I
suggesting.
know we need to wrap. So
Yeah,
let me
we
take
have to wrap.
Let me wrap this with the following thought, because I want to go back to Jeff's question that he asked to Seth as a way of wrapping it about UI. And I'll tell you again, been at this for a decade. What do I think we need more than anything? And I keep coming, and I might not be right, but I keep coming back to this question of is our organizations aligned to attack the problem? So let's look at labor. Let me give you one example. So if someone came up, he said it, but he went over it quickly. Someone came to us with this idea. They said, when corporations pay direct deposit their employees to banks know that when they're getting it in, that it's a payroll deposit. They could tell that to you, and you could know that a person is back at work. You don't have to rely on the W-2 or the W-3 forms, which you're having trouble with. You can actually get that information direct from banks. So as a result, now we're working with the banks to see if this information flow can happen. That is an opportunity.
Yep.
And the issue that I have for the Labor Department is how do they, that came to us by luck, by happenstance. It didn't generate out of the organization. I want to make sure that within the Labor Department, there's an organizational approach that's looking for these solutions,
Right.
understanding what their portfolio of errors are and where the highest ROI is. And where I think we need help right now in the government is how do we go from 0 to 60 in building that organization around this particular problem? Because you're right, MasterCard and all these other companies are doing well, but they didn't start it at 60 miles per hour.
So I don't think we're quite as far along as to what we do across the next few months here in our strategic sourcing, partly it's a more complex area. I agree with Greg in that we need to disaggregate this and then get it down to the early wins, the low-hanging fruit. I think when we do that, Danny, it'll enable us to unsurface things like your bank relationship piece you just did on payroll. But I think why don't we do some of that disaggregating, prioritization, and then try to drive a work plan off of that. But I think we're gonna need a phone call,
Yep.
at least with the
Yeah,
subcommittee to do
absolutely.
another round of
This
this.
is helpful.
Let's break now, because I want to do the quick updates on our 2011 initiative, IT and SES, and then we've got the president in 20-25 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Good luck.
Last time, so I'm thinking of you last time.
Actually,
Thank you. All right, we're gonna run,
let's do it. Is that this, Enrique, want that?
okay.
Enrique, I don't know if that's your problem. I have a,
Do you have any
I have a
questions?
plum, and I
Thank
think
you,
you're an
that'll work.
I think you're an auditor.
Thank you, I really
Thanks,
appreciate
Senator.
it.
And as of right now, we've been posted on time,
What time?
20 of, so we should probably leave here at 15. So we'll run these two updates as 6-7 minute updates.
We're supposed to be there in 20 minutes?
Just right across the street.
Okay.
It's that big white.
Yeah, I got it. I got it.
I did that.
Hey, Steve. All right, since Steve, is John coming through?
He's right behind
All
you.
right, why don't we start with you? We're going to try to do, sorry to squeeze you. The point of this session is we do not want to have a set of 2011 initiatives that happened in 2011 and ended in 2011. You guys got us off to a good start. Kind of just saying in 2011 on SES and IT, the PMAP got us headed in a good direction. It's these early wins, but the whole point is to hardwire this and institutionalize it. So at each meeting, we're going to come back to you and give you a quick update on IT and SES and where we are. Why don't we start with IT? We've got 15 minutes at most between the two of you, so why don't you each run 6 or 7 minutes?
I'm going to take like 5 if I can. So thank you all for hearing this update. I know last time we sat down and talked about vendor management organizations, investment review boards. You heard from the pilot agencies who are doing this work, and I thought today I'd just give you a quick update. Slide 23. We're going to just spend maybe 30 seconds on it. On vendor management, and you heard a lot last time from the agencies that are doing this work. The key milestones we've hit since the last time we saw each other is one is the establishment of maturity models across government. So we're now assessing, working with Joe Jordan, who I think you heard from this morning, who runs federal procurement policy, the dovetail of strategic sourcing with vendor management to think about how do we create centers of excellence that know areas of technology, and then how do we apply that to relationships with the vendors. And so this maturity model has been the first step. And then the second is setting goals and aligning those goals across those agencies. And I thought the great update for you is that we've, since establishing this, we've hit a milestone of saving about $40 million in the last 6 months of renegotiating contracts through this new model, setting goals. The Veterans Administration now has a group they call the Ruthless Reduction Task Force that is going
So
in.
the 40 million is just
Just the 6 months, just through this
Just 6
process.
months, just the
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And so Patent and Trademark Office, General Services Administration, I think you just heard from Dan, are all also doing this, and Treasury is probably the farthest along as well with a group that's doing vendor management. As far as next steps on this, it's all about scale. It's taking it and scaling it across government, and I'm excited that Joe Jordan's now in seat so that we can take that forward. Slide number 24, and this is probably the most exciting area of focus for me, and one where I'm very hands-on, is investment review boards and portfolio management in IT. At last PMAB meeting, if you remember, Jeff and I launched this initiative called Portfolio Stat, which is a process, a data-driven process that ends up being a face-to-face assessment of working with agencies on going through their IT portfolio and assessing where they are relative to the agency all up. What's amazing is that in many cases this hasn't been done in these organizations, and what's very apparent is the amount of duplication across agencies, the culture of sort of fiefdoms wrapping their arms around the work that is happening, and lots of opportunity to break that down. We kicked Portfolio Stat off this week. Over the last month or so, agencies have been gathering data for us and kind of building the case of evidence of the things from the farthest corners of their agencies, and the face-to-face meetings started this week. I thought I'd give you a quick example. So I'm doing 6 of these this week with different agencies. I'm meeting with every single cabinet level agencies and others to do really 2 things. One is to run through the rationalization of their portfolio, and the second is teach them how to run an investment review board. So we use this meeting bringing the deputy secretary, the chief financial officer, the chief acquisition officer, the chief information officer, the budget side of OMB, and myself in the room to really kind of show them what an investment review board really needs to be. So we start and end every meeting with the mission of the agency, the objectives. We don't start with the tactic, we start the mission, talk about what they're trying to accomplish, and then work our way down to how are we doing that, rationalizing the portfolio. So as an example of the data that's come in, these 6 agencies, I won't name them, but they represent about $6.2 billion of federal IT spending, which on the civilian side is about 16% of our portfolio. Our whole portfolio with DoD is about $80 billion cash outlay every year. So this small snapshot of 6 is $6.2 billion. And as far as the opportunities that we see in there, we have self-reported in those 6 agencies about $3,400 per employee on mainframes and servers. If we just bring that down to the government average, and industry average of about $2,000, we'd save $376 million one time. This group spends about 9% of their IT budgets on telecom systems. If we bring that down to an average of about 6%, that's $187 million. $252 per employee on identity management. If we bring that down to $195, which is our average, that's $15 million. Those 3 stats right there is $500 million, and it's 6 agencies across a body of 24 and 16%. So that's 1/5 of $500 million and 1/5 of the government agencies waiting for us out there if we want to seize on that. So it's not, these aren't hard and fast, I'm not setting these as sort of unachievable goals, not an over-promise, under-deliver, but it's really kind of shows us the realm, the envelope from which we can reap savings here on the portfolio's rationalization side. And more importantly is building a culture of both looking at the bottom of the IT list and cutting it in favor of putting it onto the CapEx side of the equation, and instilling a culture of getting the key players in a room together to rationalize this stuff together. And so what we're going to see is that I'm, of course, have all these meetings set up. They're set up through the beginning of August. End of August, agencies owe us a final plan on their rationalization of their portfolios with an implementation time frame. The key point of that is just we're going to drive really hard to get agencies to be very aggressive in these areas to run this consolidation and get through this. We're doing a lot on cloud computing and investment vehicles and acquisition vehicles that are going to make it much easier for them to do this rationalization. And so I think we have the right elements of the 1-2 punch to get this stuff done. And to close, again, thanking you for all the work. I mean, it was sitting down with many of your agencies. I just sat with the Department of Education yesterday, and they talked about their time with Adobe, and they now have a model on measuring their IT investments that's very unique in government, not unique in the private sector, and certainly was a model I think we gleaned from our time there. And we, with our imperative from the president to really innovate with less, I think this presents a huge opportunity for us to take the savings side of the equation and pour it into the innovate side, and I think there's good things happening.
John.
Thank you.
Page 26 and 27. Want to just, I'll be very brief. I want to thank everybody for helping us on this, especially Sabre Holdings and Cummins. In terms of the executive development and training programs, they're up and running now. We have done 2 of them, and I want to thank Gail, who's been one of our first speakers, and Jeff and Greg and Sam, who all of you have helped us by coming and helping to speak at these. You'll see at the bottom there some upcoming training events where we'll have a significant number of, we'll probably be reaching over 1,000 at these 3 events. So, it'd be a really great opportunity. If your schedules allow, you can see the date. So if any of you are available, we will very graciously take you up on the
Scott, we're
offer.
gonna need a follow-up.
And it'd be a huge help to us. The other thing that's also been launched, that program we've been doing with the Federal Executive Institute and the onboarding approach with new executives, but also an existing training program for all of the other onboard executives already. And we've called that Leading Edge. And it had 4 components, thanks to your all's help, and you advised us with that, sort of having a good speaker training series, having an executive network that was sort of confidential, that they could share information and questions among each other, coaching component to it, and then a service project component that would be multi-agency, trying to get us at that, working across silos, working across departments with the original intent of the Senior Executive Service. So first session was held, very great attendance. We had, did it in the largest auditorium we had in town, full house, and so we'll be keeping going with that. On the SES appraisal system, again, thanks to you guys and loaning us so much of the work that you had done on that. We now have that up and running at the VA, at Labor, and at OPM, we're 5 months into it. It's looking good, and now the trick is getting each and every agency to come on board with this. And so
18 have committed now?
Yep, and we will have over 80% done by 2014 is the goal now, but I've challenged my people, let's make it, what do we need to do to make that 100 and do it at the same time frame. So we'll be back to you on that. I hope to get the gap closed between the 80 and 100 by the next time we get together.
And my notes for the next session say 11 are online already and the rest in 2 years, is that true?
Yep.
Okay,
And
good.
I think 18 have fully committed,
Yeah.
11 are online, and we're gonna have, John saying we'll have 100% for the next.
Yeah, I'm gonna,
I'm
that's
saying too.
I'd like to see, I don't see why we can't. I mean,
No.
They're saying, well, it's up to we between Jeff and I, we ought to be able to get compliance. One real quick question, employee viewpoint surveys. We do surveys of our employees, but we do it as an in-house, pretty cumbersome, 89 questions.
Employee satisfaction.
Yeah, only have about 89%, less than sort of 40 to 50% uptake. We are looking right now at how we can do this better, smarter. And I know a lot of you have, I know you all must be doing this, and I'm wondering if you could help us with some advice on employee viewpoint survey. It'd be really great.
So we use a thing to measure customer partner satisfaction called the Net Promoter Score, which is really asking them one question.
Same.
We actually turned that into an internal employee survey, and so ultimately you could actually get so much data out of a much smaller set of questions. And ultimately there's one question you're really looking at, which is would you recommend it? And that really gives you a sense of what people really feel about the organization or agency. If you want, we can put you in touch with the person who runs it for us.
There's a lot of discussion of sort of the 12-question meta-analysis approach. I don't want to name any companies, but is that one that, or is there one that you all go with?
We're there.
Yeah.
What, Gail, I'm sorry?
I used it in 2 companies and we really loved it. It's a lot more expensive than this approach, but you get 90% participation like this, because it's less than 10 minutes to fill it out.
Gotcha.
We get 80-90% every time.
That's what I feel like we ought to do.
We used a different type of approach, but the main thing we got out of it was an assessment of the overall organization, but also at the unit level, how the employees thought about the quality
Absolutely.
and the culture of their unit. And so that was very helpful to manage performance and track over time. Side effect, which is our
Boy, that would be fantastic. If maybe through Scott, we could send out an email blast
Why don't I
and
do
you
that?
guys
I'll-
could give us the
I'll
right
send out,
contact.
an email to everyone, gather some thoughts, and I can funnel that back.
Be a
to
huge
John.
help.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right.